So the first Bleach battle analysis of 2022 is gonna be a big one, and that's because you guys voted for it to be Ichigo vs Grimmjow Round 3, their epic final clash. Now, is it a little bit weird to talk about Round 3 before we've even discussed Rounds 1 and 2? Yeah, probably, but that's on me for making it a poll option in the first place. But truth be told, I'm really looking forward to talking about this absolutely seminal battle. Definitely one of the most famous and important fights in the entire series. Before we get started, guys, if you haven't already, make sure to hit subscribe as you're in the best place for Bleach content like this every single week. Also, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well, because it really does help give us more exposure on the old YouTube algorithm. It means more Bleach fans like yourselves get a chance to watch this video and partake in the discussion. And if you want to help support me a little bit further, we do also have a Patreon for the channel as well, where you can get videos like this one early, and you can support me there for as little as $1 a month. And all the names coming up on screen right now are people doing exactly that, supporting me over there on Patreon, helping me do what I love and bringing you Bleach videos like this every single week. So a massive thank you goes out to everyone over there. I really appreciate the support. So, Ichigo versus Grimmjow on the sands of Hueco Mundo. This is a fight that Kubo was building towards for a very long time. Like I said, the rivalry and relationship between these two characters had been just building and building, and there was an anticipation of their final battle that would eventually take place. Of course, Grimmjow is really the face of the Arrancar villains for essentially the first half of the Arrancar arc, the Arrancar invasion sub-arc, and then the Hueco Mundo sub-arc does some kind of weird things with Grimmjow's character, I think, and that he does kind of get pushed to the wayside a little bit and then sort of re-emerges for his final battle with Ichigo. And that's mostly because I think Ulquiorra is starting to take the center stage as the main Arrancar bad guy by that point. But regardless, fans were hoping for an epic clash, and that's what they get. This is a fight for the ages, and I do really like this battle as well. And it's quite a lengthy battle as well, with its manga lifespan reaching from chapter 278 right the way through to chapter 286, and it's a lovely, totally uninterrupted fight, which is something we very much appreciate here. And I just want to mention briefly as well that this fight begins with probably one of the coolest preludes we've ever seen, with the Grimmjow versus Ulquiorra skirmish that lasts for a chapter, but this was pure fan service. Back in the day, I was so happy to see this. These two characters had been snapping at each other's heels for ages. Grimmjow like a rabid dog to Ulquiorra's kind of statuesque authoritarian figure, always trying to ignore the rabble, but finally he gives in here and actually fights Grimmjow when Grimmjow has been openly insubordinate, and it was just a really cool way to get people amped for the fight to come. As for Ichigo, we've talked about him obviously a fair bit on this channel, and his major arc throughout the whole Arrancar arc is his descent, his fall from grace essentially into hollowdom, and then his resurrection out the other side again. And this fight is the first sort of major milestone on that journey for Ichigo. He's arrived in Hueco Mundo, he's taken out characters like Dordoni, who's not really a particularly big deal, but then he gets up against Grimmjow here, and this is his first sort of major hurdle on that sort of downward spiral journey towards becoming more akin to a hollow, which would of course eventually culminate in his actually transforming into a monster in the fight against Ulquiorra. And then when we say his resurrection out the other side, that's because he, after that horrible, terrible moment upon the top of the dome, Ichigo's journey culminates in him becoming more Shinigami-like than ever with the final Getsuga Tensho and reaching a new plane where his powers have harmonized and he's able to save the world, essentially. But as I mentioned, this fight against Grimmjow is more than just a stepping stone for Ichigo's journey into hollowdom. It's also the culmination of a rivalry that has stemmed the majority of the arc so far. And in that sense, this is a bit of a weird battle. In my opinion, this is possibly the most even-feeling fight in the entire series. Ichigo never really feels like he is fighting an uphill battle, unlike against Ulquiorra in their final fight, where it really feels like Ichigo is scrabbling for every small win. You know, against Ulquiorra, it's a big deal is made of the fact that Ichigo's actually able to land a hit on this guy, but even when Ulquiorra pulls away, he's barely been nicked. The difference here is that it feels like two very evenly matched fighters finally able to have the showdown they've been waiting for. But it's also weird because, in my opinion, this fight kind of feels like it gets left to the wayside a little bit, particularly as you move along in the story. And I think the reason for that is because many people consider the absolute pinnacle of Ichigo's battles in the Urankar arc to not be against Grimmjow, but against Ulquiorra. That's where an enormous portion of his development comes from. That's where this journey into the heart of the world of Hollows really takes hold of our main character. And so this battle with Grimmjow does end up feeling a little forgotten, I think, overall, especially since the stakes in general do feel a little smaller. Ichigo never really feels in too much trouble. But I do think the crux of this fight lies somewhere entirely different. In many ways, this is actually a fight for Ichigo's soul. But we'll get into all of that in a little bit. From the get-go, the fight does feel very even. The characters are on even footing. Even the dual title pages for the Jugulators chapter seem to depict these characters in extremely similar stances, looking very similar and battle-ready, and just on the whole, very equal. And I have to commend Orihime here as well. At the very start of this battle, I appreciate her fortitude against Grimmjow when he wants her to help heal Ichigo and prepare him for the fight. Orihime basically says, "I won't help you, kill him." And she actually stands up to this ruthless and violent Espada, who she knows is capable of... she's witnessed him butchering Lowly and Menoli, and she still stands up to him regardless, which I do think is impressive. But of course, Ichigo intervenes and they prepare to fight. Ichigo's whole demeanour is very different in this battle, and in my opinion, this fight is the last time we get to see a truly strong and steely resolved Ichigo until the eventual final battle against Aizen, when he has achieved his new level of power. And that's because this is the tipping point. This is the moment where things are still mostly going okay. He's had a very bad run-in with Ulquiorra, but that's kind of a hint and a tease that there is considerably more darkness lying, waiting for Ichigo at the heart of Hueco Mundo. But here, in his battle against Grimmjow, healed up by Orihime, he's more ready to fight than he's ever been. And this is an Ichigo very reminiscent of his Soul Society era self. In many ways as well, this is one of the most tropey feeling fights in the series, I think. You know, Ichigo says to Grimmjow, "Let's take this fight somewhere else." The two girls are watching on the sidelines, cheering him on. In that sense, it does feel very much like a shonen big battle. And I also love the way imagery is used here. Ichigo activating his Bankai, immediately soaring through the air and coming crashing down on the floor, showing the shattered paneling beneath him, really shows you his resolve and where he is going into this fight, that he is here and he's ready to throw down. And I really like that. And then the fight begins in earnest with the two of them clashing. And as I mentioned, the paneling throughout is doing its absolute best to show you that these two are equals. Their eyes next to each other, them using their blades next to each other. They are basically supposed to be two sides of the same coin, essentially. And I also really enjoy the choreography early on in this fight. There's some really nice stuff here. Grimmjow tries to use an early Sero against Ichigo. Ichigo realizes this and drives his blade home, pressing it against Grimmjow's palm and essentially cancelling out his blast before trying to activate a Getsuga Tensho of his own. Realizing Ichigo's plan, however, Grimmjow tosses away his own Zanpakuto and tries to hit him with a second Sero with his now free hand. And it's just really nice stuff like this that I really do enjoy seeing. And Kubo's so cinematic when it comes to these fights. There's an entire page after this of Grimmjow grabbing his sword, and while that might be a little bit ridiculous, it does look like a movie. It looks like a film with the way the camera swoops in to Grimmjow's Zanpakuto and then he just grabs it. I love that sort of thing. Now, with these battle analysis videos, we are always talking almost exclusively about the manga version of these fights. However, for me, I just want to briefly bring up, I was highly anticipating this battle in the anime, and I remember being quite disappointed at points. I remember thinking this early choreography section just didn't look as good in the anime, and I think that's because they were probably saving the budget for Grimmjow's Resurrection, which, you know, makes an awful lot of sense. Now, considering how desperate Grimmjow is to fight Ichigo here, he does an awful lot of talking, but this is quite an interesting battle because it seems like both characters are trying to perhaps validate one another. Grimmjow thinks that Ichigo being here to save Orihime is a bit of a farce, and that really he's just here because he loves the fight, he wants to fight, and the two of them are destined to battle, being Shinigami and Hollow. And, you know, Ichigo is maintaining that he didn't come here to kill Grimmjow, but Grimmjow's like, you know, I've hurt your friends, you know, I've wounded your friends, I helped bring them here, and now you must kill me. We have to fight to the death, it's the only option. You know, what other reason is there to fight? There's also an interesting little moment where Grimmjow says, you know, Orihime looks fine on the outside, but you don't know what we've done to her internally, and Ichigo is worried that something's happened to Orihime's mental state while she's been here. This might just seem like Grimmjow trying to rile Ichigo up, and it does seem to work, but it also is something of a dropped plot point, I believe, because it is also brought up again in the battle with Ulquiorra, this idea that maybe Orihime has turned traitor or something, or that something has happened to her mentally, but nothing ever really comes of it, and it feels like the same vein as Orihime promising to reject the existence of the Hogyoku. That is never brought up again, and it kind of feels like most of the inner workings of Orihime's time in Hueco Mundo were kind of scrapped, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Although Grimmjow is pretty happy with how the fight is progressing so far, he wants to push Ichigo that little bit further, in the same way that Dordoni wanted to see Ichigo's true power as well. But of course, Grimmjow has already experienced this power once before, and now he wants to face it at its absolute purest, and so to do so, he pushes Ichigo to the brink by using a Gran Rey Cero. This is an amazingly powerful Cero activated by using an Espada's blood combined with the Cero, transforms it into this enormous attack, and it looks so cool in the manga. Now, admittedly, it does kind of look like every other Cero, just bigger, but it has these cool shockwaves around the edges of it as well, and there's a real ferocity to this attack. And by the way, I love how this looks in colour too. But I also just want to mention again, this is another area where the anime version slightly disappointed me, and admittedly, we haven't reached Grimmjow's Resurrection yet, so they were probably still saving that budget, but I just remember thinking that I wanted to see a massive blast from Gran Rey Cero, and I remember it in my head as it looking kind of weird, like it looking sort of like a ball that was like bouncing around towards Ichigo. I remember thinking it didn't look quite right, but in the manga, as always, it just looks so cool, and it's really awesome to see Grimmjow just totally letting loose and finally being able to fight without restraint, without somebody holding him back, which is something we'll mention later as well. Now, this is the first time we've ever seen a Gran Rey Cero, and it's actually only one of 2 times we ever actually see it in the manga. The second and final time, by the way, spoilers here for the 1000-Year Blood War arc, is actually used by Ichigo himself in the battle against Yhwach right at the very end of the series. However, a Gran Rey Cero is also used by Xylopora Grans in the sort of non-canon tie-in Hell movie chapter, which was really cool to see because Xyl never even used a Cero, so that was pretty nice. But now here is where things get really interesting for the themes of this fight, for what this fight really means, and it goes back to what I said earlier about the crux of this fight being about Ichigo's soul, the battle for his soul, for his humanity in many ways. And this is where the start of Ichigo's downfall begins in this fight. In order to defend Orihime and Nell from Grimmjow's wayward Cero, he's had to finally pull out the Hollow Mask, something he has been seemingly reticent to do, and you can immediately see why. Although he has managed to protect Orihime from this blast, when he turns to face her, she doesn't recognize the face she sees anymore. He looks monstrous, inhuman, sinister, and evil in nature. And of course, that isn't who he is. He is still himself at heart, or at least he wants to think he is. And the way Kubo draws Ichigo's eyes behind the mask are a real insight into how he's actually feeling. The mask might look monstrous, Ichigo's eyes might now be black and hollow-like, but they still depict a range of human emotions for now. And it's also at this point that Grimmjow reveals his hugely anticipated Resurrection Pantera, which was actually teased in both battles against Ichigo and Shinji, where he was always being held back by somebody else. Now he finally gets a chance to let loose and show us his true power, and it looks okay. It's not my favourite resurrection in the series by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it does fit Grimmjow, and it does look both cool and uncool at the same time. I don't really know how to describe it, to be honest, but I do like it, and it is iconic. I love the extreme mane of shocking blue hair, and then that's mostly all I like about it. I don't really know how else I would have done it, though, because he does look lithe. He looks, he has incredible mobility now. It is a little bit weird that his iconic mask fragment is seemingly completely gone in this form, replaced instead by a small crown, obviously a reference to his motivation and his backstory, which we'll get into. But really, this form is not the coolest, I don't think. But it's good, and I think it gets across what it needs to, which is an incredible sense of speed and ferocity. And Kubo really goes to town with that, depicting Grimmjow as this insanely agile fighter who leaps around, spins in the air, hits Ichigo with his bare hands, now being essentially a hand-to-hand fighter in this form, and you really get the sense that this is a very visceral fight all of a sudden, and I really like that. And in fact, I would also argue that the way Ichigo looks at the moment is his most iconic look in the series, particularly with people who don't necessarily know the series all that well. This version of his mask is absolutely the most famous one. He's using his original Bankai. This is definitely his most iconic appearance. And then Harabelle, I believe it's her first ever speaking role. I could be wrong about that, but I think it is. She and her Fraction are watching the fight from afar, and she basically mentions how, despite Ichigo being human, the Reiatsu, the sinister nature of the energy they're feeling, makes it feel like they're actually two Espada fighting each other, and this is, of course, another herald of Ichigo's eventual descent into true hollowdom. That balance between his humanity and his hollow side is on a knife's edge at the moment, and it'll only continue to be exacerbated further into the fight. Ichigo and Grimmjow continue to clash, and Ichigo's trash talk towards Grimmjow seems to validate the Espada's theory that Ichigo is actually just there because he wants a good, clean battle, and he's not really there to save Orihime. He just came to seek out people of his level of strength. And Ichigo is really talking some smack to Grimmjow in this fight, basically saying, it would be boring if you went out of your release state, so make sure you don't, as he slices him across the chest. And this again is an Ichigo very unlike one we've ever really seen before, really getting into that hunger for the fight, that same desire for battle that the apparition of Kenpachi mentioned to him when he was trying to overcome the hollow within. And so we get to that idea of this fight's major crux. This battle against Grimmjow doesn't really have too many stakes in terms of the grand, wider story, but despite the explosions and the crazy transformations, this is actually a very deeply personal battle for Ichigo. It's a constant tug of war between his humanity and that hollow side, that hollow influence that is emerging the further into Hueco Mundo he goes. Orihime standing on the sidelines represents this pure humanity of Ichigo's that she is concerned he is potentially losing or throwing away forever the deeper this battle goes on. It's a very important takeaway from this fight that Ichigo is clearly relishing this battle. He is loving this battle and having a great time, but crucially, he never gives up on his humanity. Again, the choreography is really great. Grimmjow does some crazy spin kick thing at one point. Ichigo drags his sword across Grimmjow's arm, the sparks flying like crazy as the Hiero is defending Grimmjow. This is one moment that the anime absolutely nailed as far as I'm concerned. I think the budget obviously was here now. The fight was really amped up. Encirclement battle is playing at one point, I think, as well. It's a great fight at this point, and things are really heating up. But it's a very telling moment that Orihime begins to question if Ichigo is really himself or not, if he's really the Ichigo she knows the moment he dives in to protect her from Grimmjow's missiles. Despite him clinging on to that thread of his humanity by choosing to protect Orihime in that moment, he also looks up at her and looks more terrifying and evil than ever, his face shrouded in shadow, but the gold of the hollow eye is bleeding through, and she is truly afraid of him now. This person she's known for so long, the man she loves, she is now scared of him. And it's quite a sad moment because Ichigo realises this, he understands it, but he also realises that he has to use this power to win. The negative side effect of Ichigo tapping further and further into his hollow powers is that he is pushing Orihime away and scaring her at the exact same time. On the flip side, Orihime is acutely aware that of course Ichigo is there fighting, putting his life on the line for her, but at the same time, the power of hollows twists people, and when she looks at him, she sees only the monster that her brother Sora became right at the start of the series. And so you have this eternal battle that both of these people are fighting. And I think that's a really cool subtext, to be honest, and it really shows the early sort of hurdle Ichigo goes through on this journey in Hueco Mundo. And so the main conflict of this battle doesn't come from Ichigo needing to defeat Grimmjow, it's from Ichigo needing to understand that he doesn't need to lose himself in the process. Both Ichigo and Orihime exchange numerous glances throughout this fight as the battle is ongoing, but neither can see the other one properly. Their vision is obscured at each of these different points. And again, that's to show that they are not walking the same path currently. Ichigo's battle with Grimmjow is mostly at a stalemate. They are bloodied, they are injured, they keep wounding one another, they basically keep saying that, I'm not going to give up, you look like you're hurting pretty badly yourself. No, actually, I'm ready to keep going another round. And that's because Ichigo cannot see the path ahead. He can't forge ahead because he is slipping further and further into the influence of the hollow, which he thinks he needs to do in order to win. However, finally, after some coaching from Nell, Orihime realises that she must cheer Ichigo on. It's the principle of the fact. Whether or not he is there to save her or not, she's currently unsure. He might just be there for one hell of a fight. But regardless of that, no matter his reasoning, she still doesn't want him to get hurt or even worse, to die. And particularly, she doesn't want him to lose himself. And so finally, with that knowledge, she calls out to him. And that's why when Orihime calls out to Ichigo, it's this huge revelatory moment, like she's some giant beacon in the sky behind him. It's because, as I said a minute ago, when they tried to catch glimpses of each other during the fight previously, they were obscured, they couldn't see each other properly, but now she is clear as day to him, and that's because she is flat out telling him, you just don't have to get hurt anymore. You don't have to lose yourself for this fight. And it's also crucial as well that the majority of the mask has gone from Ichigo's face at this point in time. He wakes up, the hollow influence begins to disappear, and things begin to change. Crucially, Orihime reminds him of his humanity that was slowly slipping away, and he instantly catches Grimmjow's hand. Now, him being able to just suddenly catch Grimmjow's hand, all because Orihime called out to him, is a little bit cheesy, but the message is clear. Ichigo fights for his friends, but it's Ichigo's friends who forge his path ahead. You can actually see this visualized in the extra chapter sketches that we get. Kubo shows Ichigo's power with a hollow mask on it being restrained by a number of chains, and it's only once Orihime calls out to him that power is able to break free and he's able to take control of the fight. And one thing I do want to quickly commend Kubo for here is his consistency with injuries in this fight. It's actually quite noticeable, but these characters sustain real injuries across their bodies, and they actually remain throughout the battle. And I know that might sound like a very small thing, but it really helps with the sort of realism of the battle. It helps it feel that more brutal if those fights have consequences, if those wounds stay with them, and I really like that. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into Grimmjow's backstory here, as that's its own video or also part of an inevitable character analysis for the Espada, but it's the foundations that his motivations are built upon. You know, he thinks he's a king, he doesn't want anyone looking down upon him, and this is a mindset that has been built up all throughout his life. And because of that, while it's not the deepest motivation ever, it makes a lot of sense for his character. It makes a lot of sense why he would despise authority, Ulquiorra, Tozen, Aizen. He hates all of those people looking down on him, but also it makes a lot of sense why he would surround himself with cronies. You know, he has one of the highest number of fraction of any of the Espada, and that's because they are more than just a gang. They lift him up on a pedestal. Grimmjow is a little bit like Baragon, but in a less literal sense. You know, Baragon was literally the king of Hueco Mundo. Grimmjow kind of feels like he's the king of these sands, and he's been lifted onto that pedestal by Xiaolong, for example, in the backstory. We actually see him saying that, oh, we cannot grow any further, but you, Grimmjow, were clearly made for greater things than this. And so that's really helped get Grimmjow into this mindset that he is a king built for better things. Whether that adulation was completely warranted or not, I think is hard to say, but it's also clear as day that Grimmjow is on a completely different level to the rest of the Hollows he, you know, kind of allies himself with. He then activates his final ability, Descaron, to basically finish the fight, but Ichigo is able to block Descaron and even stops it from hitting Orihime again. You see those massive blue blades kind of landing either side of her, and at this point, Ichigo lunges for his foe to end the fight once and for all. As he's driving home towards Grimmjow, Ichigo says that he gets it. He understands Grimmjow not wanting people looking down on him, but as if to invalidate Grimmjow's earlier theory, Ichigo is here in Hueco Mundo for an entirely different reason. He's here to defeat Aizen, defeat the bad guys, but more importantly, rescue his friends. And he's listing off name after name: Renji, Rukia, Uryu, Chad. And just when it seems like he's not going to say it, as Orihime watches on from the sides, Ichigo says he's also here to save Orihime, confirming that he is the man she has known all along. As the last sort of vestiges of his mask disappear, he has kind of overcome that hollow influence, shattered Descaron, and reached the heart of this ability where he impales Grimmjow. Ichigo making his intentions very clear as he smashes through the center of that hollow power is a very visual way of kind of showcasing where he's at and that he has overcome that hollow influence. Ichigo then catches the falling Grimmjow just as his mask disappears entirely, showing the humanity shining through, that he's able to even help his fallen foe, and then he goes to see Orihime. Ichigo stands before Orihime himself once again, and Orihime even says to herself in her head that he is the guy she knows once again. He's come out the other side of this fight, and he did it to protect them, just like he said he would. But despite the levity that Nell then brings, Grimmjow rises again. This fight's not over until he says it is. And he then basically charges Ichigo. We get a really nice moment where his release form just vanishes off of his body and disappears back into his sword. Obviously, Grimmjow being a surviving Espada, this is pretty much the only time we really get to see this happen. I think Noitoro reverts back, but he's also dead at that point. And Ulquiorra begins to revert back, but again, he's also dying at that point. So it's really cool to see Grimmjow just return to his normal Urankar self, but he lunges for Ichigo, but Ichigo easily bests him. And although Grimmjow seemed to think that the fight wouldn't be over until he says it is, Ichigo casting aside his sword is a symbol that Ichigo says the fight is done. Although Ichigo tries, it seems, to understand Grimmjow and quell his lust for battle, they are seemingly incompatible, at least at the moment, and Grimmjow attempts to strike him yet again, but he's then blindsided by an enormous crescent moon blade which nearly kills him, as Noitoro Jiruga steps onto the battlefield. So that's pretty much it for the final round of Ichigo versus Grimmjow, round 3, their final epic clash. The build-up of their burgeoning rivalry is finally here and done. And it's a cool fight. It's a really quite satisfying fight. Like I said, in my opinion, in many ways, it's the most even-feeling fight in the series. Ichigo never really feels too on the ropes, and I think that's very much done by design, especially when you consider the trouble he'll end up in the next big fight he has, both against Noitara and against Ulquiorra. But I really hope you enjoyed this video, guys. It was a lot of fun delving deep into this major fight during the Hueco Mundo arc. And Grimmjow makes for a really interesting competitor to Ichigo. He reminds me in many ways of other characters in the series, like Kenpachi, like Renji. But he stands alone as well, I think, and their fight is really great. But for me, the biggest selling point of this fight is that ever-swaying pendulum that goes back and forth for Ichigo between his humanity and that newfound hollow power that he has, that he's holding on to try and win this fight, and then Orihime acting like a beacon breaking through the darkness, enabling him to realize that actually he doesn't need to lose himself in this fight, and allows him to see the path ahead, and I think that's really cool stuff. Alright guys, but I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the final battle between Ichigo and Grimmjow in Hueco Mundo. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a great fight, and it really kind of shows a lot of growth, I think, for Ichigo as a character on his journey into the heart of Hueco Mundo. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.